I guess I'll ask some questions, about maybe a little poli-sci, a bit of stuff regarding economy, but it'll be pretty brief.
Don't worry, I'd love to talk.
Okay.
And where are you right?
Okay, so what do you say? China's new political leader, Xi Jinping, studied in Iowa in 1985 and then visited the U.S. in 2012. Do you expect that there will be any changes in China's foreign policy towards the U.S. economically, and would that affect the bilateral trading relationship?
We always focus in on what the leader of China thinks, whether it's Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao. But we got to remember that this is a collective system. And Xi Jinping is just one person on the 7-member standing committee. There are a lot of elders who also have influence. And so I don't know that because Xi Jinping goes to Iowa that he'll be much better to the U.S. in terms of trade relations. I think at this point, yes, there will be changes in the Sino-U.S. trade relations. I think probably we'll see things deteriorate because we're at a point where Americans, as well as other people around the world, are much less tolerant of China's mercantilist behavior. Mm-hmm. And especially in a declining global environment, we see trade really at a crossroads right now. I think the relationship could deteriorate.
Okay. Sorry. All right. And I guess in the same vein, maybe a question is, do you think there's a possibility of potentially escalating conflicts in the Asia-Pacific with China and its neighbors, perhaps because China's economic growth is slowing and it will look to distractions?
Well, right now we're seeing a very serious situation between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands, which the Chinese call the Diaoyus. The Chinese have problems not only with the Japanese, but also with the South Koreans, with countries around the South China Sea, with India. So China is trying to push out beyond its borders and control territory under the control of others. This is not a good sign. It very well may be related to deteriorating economy, but remember, these territorial claims have existed for quite some time. And it's not just the territorial claims that are an issue. China claims the entire South China Sea as an internal Chinese lake, and it is impinging on the notion of freedom of navigation. If there's been any consistent theme in American foreign policy over the course of 200 years, it has been the defense of the right to travel over international waters. So this brings China into potential conflict with the United States. We've seen a number of serious incidents over the last 4 years between Chinese and American vessels, and I don't see this situation getting better.
Okay. I guess on a more micro scale, a major problem that isn't as well regulated in China is corruption and bribery, whether in the government or in businesses. And last year saw all these scandals of mistresses like Chongqing. And so do you think there could be one thing that China should start with in order to ameliorate the situation?
Yes, it needs to become a liberal democracy. Look, corruption thrives when there are two conditions. One of them is an unaccountable political system, and the other is excessive government interference in the workings of the market. And both of those conditions exist in China. Also, what we're seeing, I think, is corruption getting worse. It's hard to really figure out whether the amounts of money are getting bigger, but there's a lot of indications that they are. And this is end of regime behavior. So corruption is getting worse. The Communist Party is delegitimizing itself. And what's really troubling is we do not see the party taking meaningful steps to stop corruption. You know, every once in a while they'll jail an official, but they've done that. And normally what we have seen are the people who have been jailed are really the losers in political struggles. We do not see independent prosecutors going after corrupt officials. And until we see that, really, a lot of the rhetoric from the Communist Party is just meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And another economics question, I would say, do you think the outflow of foreign companies from China due to rising salaries is going to become one of the reasons for China's collapse?
I don't know if what we see in terms of the migration of industry out of China will be the reason. Certainly it's a contributing reason because it is undermining economic growth. And it's due not only because of rising wage rates, but also the scarcity of labor, plus also the enforcement of environmental rules. And that's why we've seen a lot of low-end manufacturing go to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia. Some of it is starting to come back to even North America. And it's not just low-end manufacturing that is leaving China. So there is a shift in manufacturing. It's a part of it, the problem for China is reasons particularly related to China, but there's also reasons where people are starting to change their views of manufacturing. Companies want to manufacture closer to their customers, and the United States is actually becoming a low-cost location for manufacturing. That's really a problem for China because it has grown up on manufacturing, and I don't think it can make the transition to high-end value-added manufacturing, can't make the transition to a consumption-based economy. Many of these other transitions that people talk about China needing to do, I don't think it can do it within the time frame.
And I guess, do you agree that the outflow of foreign companies is a good sign that China's economy is evolving from a production-based economy into a service-oriented one? And do you think it's a sign of China's development or a beginning of its economic recession?
We see a lot of companies investing abroad from China, and that is a very bad sign in terms of the Chinese economy because it basically means that these companies, these enterprises, don't see the opportunities in China that they did before. If they did, they would be investing at home. But instead, they're looking abroad, they're looking far abroad. So this is a real problem for China. I don't think that this is a sign of a movement to a services-based economy. I think that that's a long way off. I know China has numbers that show that, but then again, that's what they want to show, and there are other indications that that is not happening at the speed that Beijing claims. So essentially, we have a Chinese economy that is not making the adjustments that people think that it needs to make.
Okay. One of the major questions is, would you think that it's possible to have more than one superpower in the world? Sino-American relations in the next decade will probably focus, hopefully, more on cooperation than conflict. But do you think it's possible to achieve a win-win situation, either economically or politically, between the U.S. and China?
Well, there have been situations when there's more than one superpower in the world. That was the Cold War. So clearly it's possible. I don't think China will become a superpower because I believe that China has reached an inflection point. We're going to see the problems become much more evident, and I don't think China will be able to make the transitions that other people expect it to. China is taking on all of its, or many of its neighbors at once is a very bad sign. It shows a lack of strategic calculation, perhaps disarray in the policy-making community in Beijing. And so China's day in the sun is, I believe, just about over.
Okay. And I guess another question is, what do you think is the greatest challenge to China's economic growth? I mean, right now there's environmental depletion, heavy pollution, rising labor costs, and maybe, I think you probably think it'll pop like a bubble soon, but.
The greatest challenge to China's economy is China's political system. Right now, we have a political system that is not permitting or implementing the reform that everyone believes is necessary. We saw a new Politburo Standing Committee unveiled at the end of the 18-party Congress in November, and we saw at least 4, maybe 5 members of the 7-member group are the so-called conservatives, who in the Chinese context means the hardline anti-reformers. These are guys who are not going to implement the reforms that are necessary, either trying to And when we were there, I can remember the first days my wife getting on the phone and saying, "Mom, China's not communist anymore." And I agreed with her. But as we lived there, as we worked there, as we traveled around the country and talked to people, it became evident that China really was very different than what it appeared. Because I had many clients, because I was practicing law, who would buzz into Shanghai, stay at the Grand Hyatt, which is one of the most impressive hotels in the world, and they would say, "China's not communist anymore." So I thought that my perception of the trajectory of China was very different from the dominant global narrative, and so that's why I decided to write the book.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I feel like when you're in China, you can just live the expat life, and I've been in China for a while too. I went to KU, I went to Hopkins Nanjing last year, and it's more like if you choose to immerse yourself in the culture or in the politics, then you can really see the real China. But if you just choose to, stay in the hotels and, mingle with foreigners, go to the foreign bars and restaurants, then you only see one perspective.
Well, my wife and I had no choice but to go out because we were practicing law. We were doing deals around the country, and you can't do deals just from Shanghai or Beijing or any of the other great cities along the coast. So we actually, had to go in and into places where most people don't go to, and just talk to people because we were doing deals, and so you end up getting a sense of what's going on. And of course, my wife's a great tourist, so I had to tag along, and we go to places and we speak to people, and it's just, you got a very different view of China than you do within the very tight circles in the expatriate communities.
I mean, I guess, do you think that, total westernization, 全盘西化 in China would be a good idea then? Like, having seen all this China was...
Yeah, that'll never happen, and it's not a good idea. People talk about Westernization of China, people talk about Western political systems, but I don't really buy into that label. Things have developed in the West because governments, to a greater extent, have left people on their own, and so people have developed their own cultures, and they've developed their own ways of doing things. And people call that Western, but I believe it only sort of arose in the West. It's more human. And so I think that what we're going to see in China is people doing the same things that people around the world do. And people will say, well, that's less Chinese, or that's